Welcome back to another episode of Growth Marketers Podcast. I'm Samuel Timothy.
And I'm Taylor Rowe. Today's episode, we covered the 5 most important metrics in your marketing funnel or in your demand gen funnel. So we outlined what those metrics are that we measure for our clients, trends that we're seeing in the industry, what we're seeing really leading companies rather in the B2B space. What are they doing really, really well? And what metrics you can look at as a key indicator of, are you trending in the right direction? How do we measure success as an organization and as a marketing department? So a lot of great information in this podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast, share it with a friend, and of course, enjoy the episode.
Hey, Taylor. So we talk a lot about demand gen as one of the key ingredients in making marketing contribute to the revenue generation for an organization. So when an organization is starting to do demand generation, obviously there are some key questions that they need to be asking themselves. What are some metrics they should be measuring in terms of figuring out how effective their demand gen campaigns are? So today's episode, we kind of want to get into some of the key KPIs or metrics that they should be considering as part of their demand gen initiative.
Absolutely. And I think one important piece of information to keep in mind is when we're walking through these metrics that we're measuring, this is assuming we have a more mature marketing department, marketing strategy that is already generating traffic and leads and sales via multiple channels. So if you're listening to this and you're just a company that's just trying to start with their marketing, some of these metrics may not apply or may not apply yet, right? And so I think we'll have another podcast to talk about some early stage marketing metrics that you should be measuring. But this is for a more mature marketing department or a larger spend. And so the first metric, to answer your question, is what we call CPA, right? And so the acronym stands for cost per acquisition. Ultimately, this is what really the main metrics that you should look at. Obviously, the big one on top of that is going to be your ROI, right? Everyone asks, what's the ROI? What's the return on investment when it comes to marketing? Well, how you get to determine that is understanding your cost per acquisition. So really simply what that means is how much did you spend in your marketing and how many new customers did you acquire, right? So a key differentiator is we're not talking about cost per lead here. We're not huge believers in that metric. I do believe it is what we call as a micro KPI. It's something you should look at a micro level, but I wouldn't make major decisions on your marketing around cost per lead because leads are pretty easy to come by, right? And there's a lot of different definitions and qualifications of what is determined as a lead. What we really care about is revenue, right? What puts food on the table, right? And so the easiest way to do this is add up all your marketing expenses. So it could be your ad spend, it could be agency fees, it could be internal marketing. If you have an SDR team or sales development or business development that's generating leads that way and setting appointments, I would also categorize that under the marketing expense because those efforts are all about awareness and generating opportunities. So add that all up and divide that by the number of new customers that you brought on, right? So if you spent $1,000 and you brought on 10 new customers, just obviously for the sake of math, right? And then your cost per acquisition is $100. For every $100 that you spent, you got a new customer. So understanding that cost per acquisition is really the first step and the key in order to scale any marketing campaigns, to understand if you are profitable, to understand your ROI, right? So how much did we spend and how many new customers did we acquire? And so you can do this today, even if you aren't in a sophisticated marketing organization, right? You're doing something. I'm sure trade shows, email blasts, we subscribe, we have marketing software, maybe we have somebody who manages our website. Maybe we do have a business development rep. So add that all up and, how much did we really spend and how many new customers did we bring on, right? And at this point, we're not talking about how much revenue those customers brought to us, anything along those lines. That's kind of step 2. It's first understanding how much did we spend, last year, last month, last quarter, and what was the net result of that in terms of number of new customers, right? And then the second question when I talk about scalability is that scalable, right? If we spent $1,000 and got 10 new customers, we spent $100,000 and we got 2 new customers, whatever the number is, can you double that, right? Can you increase that by 50% and will the output be the same? And so if you don't have a system in place, right, if you're just getting referrals, word of mouth is really the drivers of those customers, you've gone to some trade shows, but there's no more trade shows you can go to in the industry or they've all gone virtual, then the answer would be no, right? You can't scale those efforts. Last year, we spent $100,000 on 3 trade shows, but we went to every trade show in the industry. So we can't say next year, let's go spend $200,000 on trade shows and it will equal double the amount of new customers. So that's kind of some insights into what you can do with that. But again, the first metric that we would look at measuring is cost per acquisition. And again, we're looking at acquisition in terms of a new customer, not acquisition in terms of a new lead.
Yeah. And I think when you talked about like the trade shows, I think if all you've done is, let's say, trade show and there's not more trade shows available, then you kind of maxed out in terms of what you can do as well. So I think measuring the cost per acquisition and where you're spending the money and how you're generating the customer is also helpful. Like you said earlier too, even if you're not a sophisticated marketer, this might be something you can easily track from how much total investment you're making into marketing and how many new customers are being acquired.
Yep, absolutely.
So the next one obviously is lifetime value or LTV.
Sure. Yeah, that's an obvious next step when you talk about, okay, what is our cost per acquisition? When you talk about profitability, scalability, the next thing you really want to look at is the customer lifetime value, right? So how much do we spend to acquire these customers, and how does that compare to the lifetime value of that customer? And so this is something that I think is a little bit of a preference in how your organization measures success. And it also depends on your business model, right? So you see this a lot with SaaS companies. They're obviously all getting these super high valuations, worth a ton of money. You see it with, tech companies in terms of apps, Uber and Airbnb and all those companies come to mind. Basically, in the new market like that, the company who can spend the most to acquire customers for the longest period of time is going to win, right? Now, not every business has that luxury of outside capital to burn in that capacity. But what you need to understand is, what is that lifetime value of a customer? And that can help determine how much you're willing to spend. So let's say, obviously we work with a lot of B2B companies. If you're on a recurring business model or a subscription model, right? Whether your customers come to you every month or every year, whatever that is, but it's a consistent locked in contract, something along those lines, it's much easier to predict, right? So let's say again, you're selling a software and the subscription rate is $1,000 a month and your average customer stays with you for 2 years, right? Well, you just multiply that $1,000 a month times 24 months, it's $24,000. So the lifetime value is $24,000. And I would do averages because again, you're going to have customers that pay a lot more and customers that pay a lot less. But what I would avoid doing is just looking at maybe that initial transaction. We work with a lot of manufacturing companies where their first order with a new company would be a small 5,000, 10,000, something along those lines. But obviously they have to, if they're going to do 100,000 units a year, whatever they're manufacturing with this company, if they're switching over from another vendor, it's unlikely that they're going to move over a 100,000, a $500,000, $1 million contract without first kind of testing the waters, right? So a lot of times it also, you look at your sales cycle in some of those situations where it may take 12 months for you to really get into that deal, but they stay for 10 years, right? All your customers have stayed with you for 5 years, 10 years plus. So you have to consider two things. One is cash flow, right? So you can't just say, because you have to look at the payback period, right? So if we said, hey, our customers are worth, $200,000, but it's over the course of 3 years, right? A 3-year engagement. They're going to pay us $200,000. So it's going to take us 3 years to pay that back. We can't spend $50,000 to acquire a customer because we don't have the cash to sustain that, right? If you looked at any other investment and you said, hey, for $50,000, 3 years, in 3 years, I can turn that into 200. Most people would do that, right? And you would put as many increments of that $50,000 into that investment as you could. But obviously, if you're in a business, you have other cash flow considerations. You have other expenses that you have to think about, right? Obviously, payroll and equipment and overhead and all those kind of things. So again, this is something that's specific to each business, but that's how you really calculate that, right? In terms of the customer lifetime values, basically, how much does your average customer pay you over, what period of time, and just do that as an average, right? And so I would also look at if the answer is, our customers stay for more than 5 years, 10 years, something like that, I would probably shorten it. I would look at like a 2 to 3 year time period because of exactly what I just mentioned is like, yes, this customer might be worth $1 million to us over the next 10 years, but it's $100,000 a year for 10 years. Let's look at a 24-month period, right? And say, okay, this is $200,000. How much are we willing to spend in order to acquire that customer, right? So you take metric 1 and metric 2 and put those together. And that can answer a lot of your questions in terms of how much you're willing to spend, because you're going to look at what is our cost of acquisition? How much does it cost for us to acquire a customer? And what is that customer worth to us over the next 2 years? Let's scale this up. Let's put more money in. Or you might look at, this is not financially, responsible of us, right? we need to fix something within this funnel. A lot of companies also would consider profitability into that lifetime value. I think that makes sense. It just depends on your business model, right? We talked about SaaS companies, high margins, depending on what they're trying to do. Obviously, if they're just trying to increase revenue, they're trying to scale, they're trying to take that money, invest it back into the business. Profit margins aren't always top of the consideration list. And maybe high volume manufacturing companies with slim margins may have a different answer to that. So that's something you have to work on internally and answer those questions for yourself. But those first two metrics are huge when it comes to understanding the success and the value of your marketing strategy.
Yeah. And I think the simple thing to keep in mind is if lifetime value is greater than the cost of a customer acquisition, which is kind of the first metric that we talked about, then you have all the reason to continue to invest into acquiring new customers. And
especially if you are factoring in any sort of profitability into that equation, then it's a no-brainer.
Exactly. So I think the third KPI or the measurement that we need to be looking at is the funnel progression conversion rate.
Sure.
So do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So if you're up to date on any, marketing technologies, a lot of CRMs are bringing this metric into place too. You're going to see kind of a deal pipeline and deal waterfall that shows conversion rate through the pipeline, right? So if, just as a standard intro call, discovery call, proposal meeting, agreement sent or negotiation, whatever that is, and then close won, close lost. So if you look at that deal progression in that pipeline and just kind of understanding how each of those metrics are being impacted by your marketing, that's a great place to start. I would even just look at the simple metric of affected pipeline, right? So what I mean by that is marketing sourced opportunities that are in your pipeline. So again, we're moving away from this idea of just leads that are being generated and looking at, and even in this case, discounting that closed revenue, because there's a lot of factors that come in, and depending on your sales process, sales cycle, you may not really be able to judge marketing success, especially early on, right? If your average sales cycle is 6 months or 8 months or 12 months, it's hard to look at 6 months into a marketing campaign and determine the success just based on cost per acquisition or revenue or profitability ROI compared to lifetime value, right? So this is another way we can look at that and say, let's look at all of the opportunities that we have to close business. So meaning we're at a certain stage of the funnel. Whatever you determine is, once we get to this stage, we have a good chance these leads are qualified. We've talked to the decision makers. We've talked pricing. We've sent out opportunities. We have a good understanding of what needs to be done in order to close this deal. That's what I'm talking about. Whatever stage in that pipeline that is for you, look at that and then look at how many of those were sourced through your marketing efforts. And that equation, that answer to that question should determine whether or not we're seeing improvement. Then you can look at that a little bit further in some of those metrics that you mentioned of how those deals are progressing. The higher the percentage that we're moving through the funnel, right, means that the leads that are being generated are higher quality, right? This has nothing to do with the volume of those leads and everything to do with the stage at which we're converting the leads. So this might give you some indication too into how you're converting leads. A lot of B2B companies, successful B2B companies, are moving away from the open the funnel as wide as you can, gate all of your content, download ebooks, and then have, sales reps follow up a million times with somebody who downloaded an ebook, because that's a volume game. They don't convert very high. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of buyer-centric, inbound marketing model, right? Because I did it the other day. I saw a report that I thought was interesting. I downloaded it knowing full well that I was going to get bombarded. I got multiple emails. I got 2 phone calls all within, a day and a half, right? And I was not the people's ideal customer profile. It was actually another agency, and they didn't really even take the time to look at that, right? So they just we're spending money to promote this content asset, and I don't even care who downloads it. I'm going to bombard them with follow-ups, right? So that is a bad indication, because then you'll look at that deal progression model and you'll see huge numbers of intro call or call to qualify, and half of a % is moving on into the next stage, right? So a big indicator of success would be a higher number, 10%, 20%, 50%, 80%, whatever that is. And obviously, as you get closer, those numbers should be much higher, right? So after that first step, if the first one is intro call, maybe only 30% or 20% move into discovery. But once we get to discovery, 70% move to proposal. And when we're in proposal, we close 80% of those, right? So the higher those percentages are, the better indication that the original leads are higher quality. So that's just kind of a bit of an insight there on how we measure that. But again, if you just just want a quick snapshot, I would just look at the affected pipeline of marketing source pipeline.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, I think overall, at the end of the day, it all comes back to marketing and sales having good alignment and knowing who your target audiences are and running the right type of marketing campaigns to make sure that you are attracting those sort of buyers into your funnel. And then marketing and sales working hand in hand to make sure that at the end of the day, that you're efficient in your effort in reaching the right customers and winning them as customers.
Absolutely.
So the fourth one being the revenue per channel.
Yeah. And this is something that's extremely popular. Every marketing attribution software claims that, they can look at this and you can look at all your marketing channels and you can tell which one is the most profitable, which one's driving the most revenue. I look at it as more of a interesting anecdote, right? So I think it's something important to keep track of. I don't think it tells the whole picture, right? Because it's not how we as customers, we as consumers, we as buyers make purchase decisions. It's not a singular point of interaction, especially within B2B organizations, right? Now, if you're e-commerce and you're selling clothing line, something like that, I think it'd be very easy to look at influencer marketing versus social media ads versus Google AdWords versus other e-tail partners that we're in with. And you can just look at that revenue per channel. It doesn't take a ton of touch points and interactions. The business that we're in terms of business to business, there's a lot of touch points, right? And so you can be active on social media. You can be active in events, publications. You can run ads on Google. You can create a ton of content that drives organic traffic. And then you could influence that decision maker. Companies talk internally and then they go directly to your website or they go to Google and search your company name. And all of a sudden that lead and that revenue is attributed to direct traffic or organic search, right? When in reality, we know there was a million other touch points that aren't always tracked, right? So it does depend on how you're tracking your attribution. There's different models that you can track for attribution, but I just want to make sure everyone knows this is never going to be perfect. So you take it with a grain of salt. That's why I say it's interesting stat and data to take a look at. I think you can probably eliminate some channels based on it. If they're not really, you could tell they're not driving any traffic. They're not influencing the lead in any way, but I wouldn't just look at and say, well, all of our revenue comes from direct traffic. So our marketing efforts are all for nothing, right? So why is our direct traffic going up every single month? Well, because we're investing more into our social media presence and we're driving more organic traffic. We're doing this right now. People are coming back to direct traffic. They're hearing about us. We're doing a great job of brand awareness. We were on a popular podcast last month, right? Is your attribution software going to show that you were on a popular podcast? That podcast was clipped up and then shared on LinkedIn. And then people shared that internally with an organization. And then the decision maker went directly to your website because they were shared that podcast. And then they filled out a form. You're going to look at organic result or direct traffic and say, hey, this is what's driving that revenue. So I do think it's important to kind of keep an eye on, but I wouldn't put it up there in terms of a huge decision-making factor in changing your marketing strategy in a drastic way.
Yeah, we've done an entire podcast around this whole concept of attribution in the past. Yeah, but I think overall, you just need to be cautious, right? That, hey, just because some channel may not have direct impact on your revenue, they might be complementing, right? In terms of what all the other things you might be doing and getting you introduced to the right prospects. And then the last being the pipeline velocity as one of the KPIs to measure.
Yeah, to me, this is huge indicators of success. And it's almost the opposite of exactly what we talked about with that revenue per channel. It's this understanding of if we're doing the right things and we're truly driving demand, we're touching our prospects in multiple different channels. What we really should be looking at is that outcome, right? There's a little bit of a gray area, a dark area, a black box that's always been associated with marketing. It's like we're doing all these efforts. We know we're generating leads and opportunity and they're turning into customers. Well, one way we can look at that at the macro level is, are these deals closing faster? Because what that is an indicator is that we're doing a better job of educating our potential customers through our marketing initiatives. And then when they reach out to us, they're much further along in that sales process. They already have bought into our system. They've already bought into our process. We've built enough brand equity or brand affinity that they have a bias towards us already and they want to work with us, right? That means you have to do less selling, right? And more consultative sales process on the sales side, which means ultimately you should sell that deal faster, which is again, in direct contrast to the old B2B model of having people sign up for a webinar or download an ebook. Those are early stage buyers. They could be 3 years away from making a decision. So that sales velocity, that sales pipeline, that time to close is going to be much, much longer. So if you're executing at a high level on all your marketing initiatives and your inbound conversion path and inbound marketing process, if you will, is high level, then you're going to actually see that pipeline velocity increase or move faster, right? Whatever way you want to look at it. So we're going to close deals in a shorter amount of time. And this actually could be completely separate. Like you don't have to increase the lead volume to increase ROI or profitability if you just increase pipeline velocity, because now it takes less resources and less time to close a deal. That's a win. And that's something that goes unmeasured and unnoticed in a lot of sales organizations, right? A lot of, historically sales teams have been paid a lot more than, marketing departments because it's a lot of work, right? To bring on business. And a lot of times it's almost magic what they're doing because they're pulling business and opportunities out of thin air, and it might take them 5 years to work on a deal. So now we got to pay them high base salaries and commissions because they're the only ones that can drive new business, right? That model is going away. A salesperson is not the only one that has access to that information. The customers now have access to the information because they're getting that information from the marketing department. And now when they're converting, again, companies that are succeeding at this model, now when they're converting, they're much closer to that close. Requires less work, less education by the salesperson, which means your sales expenses should be cheaper. It takes in terms of who you have to hire to make that happen. And you have less salespeople to manage and handle these leads because you don't have to, each salesperson doesn't have to follow up with hundreds of leads at a time because they're closing much faster. So kind of an unknown or, little known, I would say, measurement or way to look at your ROI and performance is just looking at that pipeline velocity and how that's changing as you're improving and investing into your marketing strategies.
And I think if you're improving the pipeline velocity, it also affects your cost per acquisition because you're shortening the time it takes to close a deal, which obviously reduces the amount you're spending on acquiring that customer. And if the customers are coming on earlier, they're sticking with you longer, now your lifetime value has improved. And then obviously that's going to affect your funnel progression because it's also moving the deals much further along the funnel, right? And you're seeing the progression of those deals much faster. And then I'm sure it has some impact. You can see it on your revenue per channel as well. So ultimately, the pipeline velocity does impact all the other metrics that we touched on as well.
It's what we call full circle right there. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I mean, like I said, that pipeline velocity impacts your ROI almost as much as everything else because all of those other metrics that we talked about earlier are impacted and affected. So I think you did a perfect recap there. I think it's a good place to end the episode. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you learned at least one thing from this podcast. If you did, please give us a like, subscribe to the podcast, share it with a friend or colleague, and submit any topics or questions that you want us to cover in the future. We love hearing your feedback. We'll see you next time.
Growth Marketers is brought to you by OneIMS, helping you reach new heights through integrated marketing. One world, one web, OneIMS.